Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Mem Daled. We'll start with a review from where we ended yesterday. We had a bright machar lo bayit machar lo sadeh. If somebody sold a house or a field, ein me'ilo aleha. I'm at the top of Mem Gimel Amud Bet. If Ruth sold a field or a house to Naomi, and then Yehuda came along and said, "Hey, that's mine," so ein me'ilo aleha. Ruth is not allowed to testify for Naomi because she's responsible for that field. Okay, what that means, we're going to have to understand. We have to explain. But machar lo parat, the same thing happened, but Ruth sold Naomi a cow or a movable item, then she can testify because ein achayuto ala, because Ruth has no interest in what's going on here at this point at all. The question is why, and the Gemara didn't really understand, because you could sell both theoretically with achrayut, and then again, if Ruth were to sell it with achrayut, if someone takes it away from Naomi, like Yehuda claims this was mine, it was never Naomi's and Ruth's in the first place, then Ruth will have to compensate Naomi. So of course she has a vested interest here. So Rav Sheshet said, there must be a little bit more of a complicated case here. And actually, we're talking about that Ruth sold to Naomi stolen property that she stole from Shimon. And it's not whether Ruth is believed to testify for Naomi. It's not the one who sold it. It's the one who was stolen from. Is Shimon allowed to try to testify for Naomi's benefit when someone like Yehuda is claiming it was never Shimon's to begin with? And that's where we're going to distinguish between land and movables. Because as Rav Sheshet explained, when it comes to land, well, he didn't really explain this, but the commentaries filled in the gaps for us, which is land in an exemet. It never changes ownership. And that's why Shimon is still the owner of this land and hopes to get it back and would rather the land. And then we had to give two explanations why it matters to Shimon, whether it's in Naomi's hands or Yehuda's hands. But we suggested that either it's because Shimon thinks Naomi's an easier person to get it out of, or Shimon is hoping to get evidence at some point, right? That's in general, the whole issue is Shimon doesn't have the evidence yet. But when he gets evidence, he knows that his evidence is no different than Yehuda's. And if Yehuda takes the land now and gets it from Naomi, it'll be Shimon's witnesses versus Yehuda's witnesses, and nobody will win, but Yehuda is muhzah. He has the land. He's going to end up keeping it. And that's why Shimon wants to get it, keep it in Naomi's hands. And when Shimon gets witnesses, he'll bring them to Naomi. If he can knock out Yehuda's witnesses, then he'll be in good shape later when his witnesses come along. That was Rav Sheshet. And that explains what's the difference between land and movables, because land is still in the name of Shimon if Shimon had the land stolen. Whereas movables, if Ruth stole it and sold it to Naomi, that's what we call Shimon, we assume, had Yeush, gave up on ever getting it back, and it had Shinoi Reshut, it then changed owners. So when Ruth gave it to Naomi, it now has a new owner, and because it has a new owner, so it's already, Naomi acquires that object completely, in which case, the only thing Shimon will be able to get is his money back from Ruth, but that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether the object's in Naomi's hands or Yehuda's hands, that's an irrelevant factor, or so we think right now. So the Gemara asks, starting from the top of our daf, V'lukma begazlan, why do we have to get so complicated? Why don't we remove a person here? Why don't we just say it's the thief in Ruth's hands? Forget Naomi. Why do we need Naomi in the picture? Why don't we just say Ruth stole it from Shimon? And Shimon now, and Yehuda claims that Ruth's stolen item is not hers and wasn't Shimon, right? And is really his. And if Shimon can testify, because we can say again, let's go back to our cases. In the land case, Shimon obviously can't testify because it's in his best interest to basically prove it's his. But in the theft case, once Ruth has it, she acquires it, right? But that's because, no, not really true. So right now they think, well, they're really focusing on the land case. The land case could definitely be explained that Ruth stole it from Shimon, and basically he'd rather keep it in Ruth's hands so he could get it back because she stole it from him rather than Yehuda's hands for all the reasons we said before. But the Gemara says, obviously, it's mishum b'kabai l'mitnei seifa. It's because of the metaltalin case, the movable. Machar lo pala, machar lo talit. And as I explained already, the only reason why this works, that Shimon can testify for Naomi against Yehuda, is because dafka machal dehavele yeush v'shinui reshut, because two things have to happen. Number one is Ruth steals it and Shimon says, oh, wow, I'll never get that back. How am I going to find the thief? Then it changes domains. And when those two things happen, Shimon will never be able to get it back again. If it's just in Ruth's domain, he will be able to get it back, in which case, again, he'd rather prove that Ruth has it so he could get it back from her than Yehuda. And then it would be relevant, and then he wouldn't be able to testify, but the Braita says he can. That's why. Okay, avalo machal, if she hadn't sold it to Hadrale, he could get it back, then it wouldn't be true that he could testify. So therefore, machal. And that's why the first case said sold, because there has to be a sale going on here for the second case. So we want to compare two parallel cases. The seifa nami, but now we have a question. Nihi de miyayish migufe, midame mi miyayish. But even in the seifa, in the second part, the metaltalin case, still, theoretically, it shouldn't work. Why? Well, even if, let's go back to our case. Ruth sells it to Naomi. And the whole point, we said there's Yeush and Shinui Reshut, and therefore, he'll never get the item back. And therefore, what's the difference if it's in Naomi's hands or Yehuda takes it? But even though he's Miyayish Migufe, he has Yeush from getting back the para, the cow, or the talit. Midame mi Miyayish. He doesn't give up hopes of getting back the money. Now, therefore, if he still thinks he can get back the money, then, now let's go back and think about our case. Yehuda claims that this cow was his, meaning it wasn't Shimon's, which means how on earth is Shimon going to get his money back from Ruth if Yehuda proves in court that the cow was his? So, of course, it's in Shimon's best interest to get Yehuda's witnesses knocked out, because even though he can't claim anything from Naomi in the fights between Naomi and Yehuda, but in the end, it's going to prove that Shimon wasn't the rightful owner. So how could that be? Which the Gemara says, oh, you know what? We're going to add a fifth person, if you didn't think this was complicated enough. Lotzricha demit gazlan. We're talking about a case where Ruth died. Now, why does it matter if Ruth died? Because what we want to do is we want to come up with a case where Shimon won't have anything to collect. Now, if Naomi sold it, if Ruth sold it, then, okay, he can't get the item back, but he still could get his money back from Ruth. But if Ruth dies, he can't get his money back from Ruth's heirs, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. Ditnan, Mishnah, in the first Mishnah of the last chapter of Bava Kama, in the 10th chapter, Hagozel u'ma'achil et banav, v'hiniach lifnehem p'turim l'shalem. If somebody steals something and then his children consume it and it's no longer there, or hiniach lifnehem, or he passed it on in inheritance to them, and the commentaries say that, the Amoraim say that, and then it's consumed, they don't have it anymore, they sold it, p'turim l'shalem. The main thing here to get is that if Ruth dies, her sons inherit it, but she sold it to Naomi, okay, whether Ruth sold it or the kids sold it, doesn't matter. At that point, he doesn't get his money back, Shimon, because, okay, let's just talk about it. He won't get the item back because the item's gone. And the money for it, he won't get back either unless they have land that they inherited from the father that was kind of lean to it. But other than that, if they just have movables, they don't have to pay the money. So that would be the case that Rav Sheshet understands in the Braita, where in that case, Shimon doesn't have a vested interest here at all. But going back to the previous, if it wasn't heirs and it was Ruth herself who had sold it to Naomi and she was still alive, and Shimon, now there's a debate about whether Naomi's the owner or not, then we're going to have an issue. Because, again, if Yehuda claims he was the owner and not Shimon, then Shimon won't ever get his money back from Ruth. So he does have a vested interest. So we have to say it's talking about this kind of case where there's 5 people. Now comes the Gemara and says, wait a minute. Can't we just simplify it a little bit? Forget about Naomi. Take Naomi out of the picture. Why don't we just say, once we introduce the issue that maybe there were heirs and Ruth died, why don't we just go to a case where Ruth stole it and bequeathed it to her children? that we have Yeush and Shinoi Reshut, because it goes from Ruth to her heirs. That would be an easier case, because then you don't have to have both Ruth, her heirs, and Naomi. And then, again, we'd have heirs. So, right, again, the movable item they won't be able to get back, and the money they won't be able to get back because it's in the heir, right? The heirs had it, and let's just say they consumed it, okay? So, v'lukma b'yoresh. So they say, Hani chalamanda amar reshut yoresh lav kilokech dami. Shapir. Well, the answer would work. We'd have a good answer to this question, why they didn't give an example of a yoresh, of an heir, because some people hold there's a big machloket. I said it very simply, that when Ruth dies, it goes to her heirs, which means that it changes domain. And that would be, again, Yeush. Shimon would give up on ever despair of ever getting the item back. And Shinoi Reshu, which is the formula for they're now the rightful owner and you can't get it back, right? They don't have to give it back to Shimon. But, right, the truth is I said it wrong before. Even if they didn't consume it, they don't have to give it back. But, and they don't have to give back the value if they don't have land they inherited from the father. So, or in this case, the mother. So now that only works if you say, and we could say, they didn't use a yoresh because some people say that the yoresh is not like a lokech. Changing domains is only if somebody sells something, but if someone bequeaths it to their children are almost like an extension of themselves. And it's like keeping it in the same domain. And therefore, there's no Shinoi Reshut, in which case the object could still go back to Shimon. And that's why he'd be have a vested interest. And that's why you can't explain the Braita. That's why Rav Sheshet didn't give this case for the Braita, because it wouldn't work. But if you hold Ela Lamanda Amar, who disagrees, the person who says, Reshut Yoresh ka Reshut Lokach dami, that really an heir is like a buyer, in which case there should be Yerush and Shinoi Reshut. That should have been a case brought in the Mishnah. So that should have been a case to explain the Mishnah. So why didn't Rav Sheshet say that? And second question on Rav Sheshet is Abaye says, hey, I have a bigger problem. I think this is a bigger problem because look at the wording of the Braita. The Braita says it's because one, right, in the land case, you have a responsibility. And in the movable case, they didn't assume responsibility, right? The one has a guarantee, the other doesn't have a guarantee or has some sort of responsibility. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. What's the difference between why Shimon is believed in the land case and in the movable case and not believed in the land case? It's because the land could go back to Shimon and the metaltalin can't go back to Shimon. And that's the whole issue. Since he can't get back the metaltalin or his money, so he has no vested interest. And since he can get back his land, he has a vested interest. And that's Rav Sheshet's whole theory. That doesn't match the wording in the Braita. On account of all this, after struggling to understand this complicated sugya, we now reject it, okay? And we go with a different interpretation altogether, which is going to be a little simpler, at least in terms of the case itself will be simpler, okay? Understanding it all won't necessarily be so simple, but basically we're going to see that the Braita is going to be a much simpler case. We don't have Ruth, Naomi, Yehuda, and Shimon. We have Ruth and Naomi and Yehuda, okay? We get rid of a person at least, and we don't have an heir and all that. So, Elaka de Ravin Bar Shmuel, so we're going to explain it like Ravin Bar Shmuel. The Amar Ravin Bar Shmuel, he said Mishmei de Shmuel in the name of Shmuel, HaMochir Sadeh L'Chavero Shelo Ba'acharayut, Ein Me'id Lo Aleha Mipnei Shema Mida B'fnei Ba'al Chovo. We saw this already, which is, if you sell land to a friend, Shelo Ba'acharayut, so Ruth sells land to Naomi without responsibility, meaning saying, I'm not going to assume any responsibility for this sale, right? Probably Naomi got a pretty good price on it. It's like when you buy something in a store, it's final sale, no returns, no exchanges, no nothing. So Ruth can no longer testify about this object. Why? Because ma'amida b'fnei ba'al chovo. Because if Ruth sold it without responsibility, without a guarantee, and let's go back to our original case, David is owed money by Ruth. Ruth took out a loan from David, and David now comes and he wants to collect the loan. Where is he going to go? If Ruth doesn't have the money, he'll go to Naomi. Naomi won't go back to Ruth because Naomi bought it with no guarantees. That's the basic concept here. So if Yehuda comes along and tries to take the land away from Naomi, it's in Ruth's best interest to keep the land in Naomi's hands. Why? Now, if it was Achrayut, of course it would be in her best interest because she guaranteed the sale. If someone takes away the land, she's going to have to pay Naomi. But if she didn't take responsibility, she still has a vested interest because if David, and we talked about this already, if David takes the land from Naomi, then, or if, let's put it this way, I should have said it differently. If Naomi doesn't have land for David to take because Yehuda takes it away, then when David goes to collect the loan and Ruth doesn't have the money, and Naomi's land, it turns out, wasn't even Ruth's to begin with, then Ruth looks bad because her loan was never paid back and her credit rating goes down. So that's not good. That's what it means. She wants the land in Naomi's possession so that she has something to give to a creditor who comes. B'dafka bayit o sadeh. Aval, now this would only work for a house or a field, and that's why Ruth can't testify. But para v'talit, now if the whole reason why Ruth has a vested interest is all because of David, who's going to come and collect the loan from this land, well, that's not relevant for movable stuff. Why is that? Because when you take out a loan, land is lien to your loan, not movables. And now we're going to go through three possible types of documents that Ruth could have arranged when she took out the loan from David of responsibilities. And in none of those cases is the movable object going to be lien to this loan. In which case, why, right? That's going to explain why Ruth can testify for Naomi about this movable item, because this idea of ma'amidah b'fnei ba'al chavo is irrelevant because David can't go collect it from Naomi anyway, in which case Ruth has no vested interest. So let's go through the three possibilities. Lo mebai, you don't even need to say it, meaning it's obvious, moving now to amubet, bistama. If she just took out a loan with a regular document and then what's lien to it? It's just land. Because in a regular typical loan, your movable items are not lien to the property. My taima, metaltale ninu, and that's exactly what they're going to say. Why? Because it's movables. And metaltale lebal chov lo mishtavde. Movable property is not lien to a loan. But avagav, and case two, even if katavle miglima da al kitfe or katfe, even if she says, so we love to say from the shirt off my back, right? I'll give you the shirt off my back. I'll give you the cloak off my shoulders, literally. So if Ruth writes, you can collect the loan when they do the loan arrangement. Ruth says, I'm borrowing money from you and you can collect it even from the shirt off my back, okay, which by the way appears in the ketubah, okay, and some of the other languages today also appear in the ketubah. Now when Ruth says take it from the shirt off my back, that's only if Ruth still has the shirt on her back. But if the shirt got ruined, if she sold it to Naomi, David can't collect it from Naomi. So of course, again, another case where this would be irrelevant. Ela afilu, even in the case, so not even, right? Obviously, if she just said stam, she didn't specify. Even if she said the shirt off my back, and even if she went even further, and she said, asao apotiki, namilo. What's an apotiki? If Ruth said, I'm borrowing $100 from you, David, and you will collect it from this shirt. This is your, right, I have a really expensive shirt. This is going to be how you're going to get your money. Not any other way. It was specifically designated for this loan. Still, if she sold it to Naomi, he can't collect from there. How do we know this? My taima kedarava. Ta'amarava, asavdo apotiki umacharo. If you make your slave, Ruth had made a slave an apotiki, umacharo, and she sold it to Naomi, ba'al chov goveh mimenu. The creditor, David, could come and collect from Naomi, the slave. But shoro v'chamoro apotiki, but if it was a shore, or a donkey, or an ox or a donkey, apotiki umacharo, and any other movable item, ein ba'al chov goveh mimenu. David can't collect from there. My taima, what's the reason to distinguish between that and that? Because high itle kala and high late kala. The slave, everyone knows when you sell a slave, and therefore it gets around, and therefore David will be able to collect from Naomi when she buys the slave, because Naomi knew going into it when she bought the slave that it was an apotiki. But if it was a movable item, No one's going to know about that. And therefore, it doesn't get around about movable stuff. And therefore, when Naomi buys it, she had no idea going into it that it had a lien on it, in which that was meant for an apotiki, in which case it doesn't have a lien on it, and it's not going to be used for collection. So that explains the Braita, because the Braita says if Ruth sells an item to Naomi that's movable, well, David can't collect from it anyway. And the whole issue is, when Yehuda comes claiming the item, does Ruth have a vested interest or not? Well, if David can collect it from Naomi, then yes, even if it was not ba'achrayut, still it's in Ruth's best interest, so it doesn't look like someone who didn't pay back a loan. So he collected it from Naomi. Ruth doesn't have to shell out any cash, but it's just good for her. But, right, and if it's not, meaning if Naomi's not there, meaning Yehuda took the property, then Ruth looks bad because her loan never got paid back. But if it's movables, David can't collect it from the movables, so it really doesn't make any bit of a difference. Even if Ruth went so far as to make that object an apotiki, doesn't make a difference because David can never collect from there. So once Ruth sells it to Naomi, she has nothing to do with any anymore, and therefore she can testify. And that's the second way we explain this. We're still going to have a few questions on this, which is the lichush dilma achnele metaltele agav mekarke. They're now going to say, wait a minute, why aren't we worried for some rare case? Maybe we can't let Ruth testify for Naomi because, again, when Yehuda comes and claims this is mine, because perhaps Ruth maybe had this as an apotiki or not an apotiki, but it was just land that she did promise to David, which theoretically shouldn't work anyway. But if she promised David land and movables, then we have what's called a kinyan agav. We've learned about this before, where you can acquire metaltalin with land, also with a creditor. If she said to him, you can collect it from my movables, my cow and my land, kane mekarke and kane metaltale. Both of them become lien to the property. So theoretically, there could be a case where Ruth sold something to Naomi and then goes and testifies, and it's actually in Ruth's best interest because it could be, even if what Ruth sold to Naomi were movables, maybe those movables were lien to a loan together with land. So why aren't we concerned? And the court will say, hey, we're not going to trust Ruth to testify about Naomi and her cow, because who knows? Maybe her cow is lien to some loan together with land, in which case the lien on the cow would actually be effective. Rav Chisda just said, this halacha that Rabba said, that we just quoted, well, who de katavla, Amar Rav Chisda, who de katavla de loka asmachta u de loka tofse deshtari. This is only if he says, when Ruth said to David, I commit to you land and my shirt off my back together, as long as she said, but not, this isn't an asmachta, meaning I'm not exaggerating, and it's not like a tofse dishar. This isn't like a form letter that I don't really mean what I'm saying. Okay, I really mean it. She has to give saying, I want to make clear that I'm serious about this. I guess because people exaggerated things like this, and often it could be viewed as a smachta, which is sugya we've seen a lot, which is all about exaggerated claims and just making promises that you never really intended to keep. So she would have to use those words, otherwise it wouldn't be serious. But that's just an aside about that halacha. So we're back to our question. If that's the case, how could we say that Ruth, for sure we know she doesn't have a vested interest? She might. So again, we're going to say hachab ma'askina, and it must be in a particular case. We could say the case is when Ruth acquired the cow, bought it, and immediately sold it to Naomi. In which case, right, in order for a lien to take place, what usually happens is first you own it, then you take out a loan, and then whatever you have already in your possession or something you had in your possession becomes lien to the property. And then this case would happen where Ruth would then sell it to Naomi. But if the sale and the resale, the buy and the sale happened immediately, there was no time to have had the loan couldn't have been in between. So we could explain it like that, to which the Gemara says that's still not sufficient. Maybe she said, I promise you this land and movables that come into my possession later. In which case, when she buys it, even if she resells it immediately, it becomes lien to the loan. So the fact that we're not worried about this, the Gemara then tries to conclude something and says, well, could we learn from here? Shmat mina, could you learn from here? De'ikne kane umacher kane v'horish lo mishtabed. Could you derive from here that if you say it's going to, right, anything that will be acquired, kana umachar kana v'horish lo mishtabed. So if, right, it sounds like if I say, in this loan, or Ruth says to David, I'm committing to you that anything I acquire later will be lien to this. And there was land also at the time. So she could then connect movables that if she were to sell it, it's really not liened anymore. Okay. Or if she were to pass it on in inheritance, it wouldn't be liened to the loan anymore. Could you say that? Because the fact that, in other words, what they're basically saying is the fact that we're not worried about this means because maybe halachically there's no ramifications. It wouldn't be relevant, wouldn't be liened, and that's why it's okay. To which the Gemara says, lo tzricha, what you could explain is, you could explain this case that Ruth had witnesses who came along and said, and as Ruth is going to be believed to testify again, this is all about Naomi against Yehuda who's trying to take the land away. Or in this case, the cow away. She's believed because what was our whole concern? Maybe there's a creditor who has a lien on this cow. How would that work? Only if Ruth promised land together with movables. Well, if there's witnesses who say that Ruth never owned a piece of land in her life, then there's no way she could have done a commitment to David with land together with movables. So that's what you would have to say. And then you wouldn't be able to derive that side halacha that future things actually maybe could be lien. We don't really know. We just don't know. But you could say, in order to say that's not necessarily the case, is you could say the case is just that it's clear Ruth never owned land. Okay, wow, that was complicated. Now we're going to have another question, in case we didn't have enough questions. V'ha'amar Rav Papa, but wait, didn't Rav Papa say, Af agav da'amar Rabbanan, ha'mocher sadeh lechavero shelo ba'achrayut, uba ba'achov u'tarfa, eno chozer alav. Even though the rabbi said, Rav Papa said, even though the rabbi said that if you sell a field to a friend without any achrayut, and comes, okay, that's what does it mean without a guarantee, right? Ruth sold her land to Naomi, said, I'm not promising you anything, which means what? If David comes and says, hey, Ruth owes me money, Ruth doesn't have the money, I'm seizing the land from Naomi, Naomi loses out entirely, right? Eno chozer alav, basically, Naomi has no claim and Ruth doesn't have to pay her, and that's the situation. But nimtzeit she'ena shelo chozer alav. But the eno chozer alav, just to be clear, means it doesn't end up getting back to Ruth. Naomi has to pay it. It's like we said, final sale. There's nothing you can do. You can't come back to me with any claims. Ruth says, I'm done. Okay? But here comes Rav Papa with something different than we thought until now. And in a minute, we'll see that Rav Zuri doesn't agree with him. But if it turns out, if it turns out that this land was never Ruth's to begin with, if Ruth sold land to Naomi, final sale, and then it turned out it was stolen property and it never belonged to Ruth in the first place, and it was really Yehuda's land, chozer alav. Of course we go back to Ruth, okay? There's no such thing as final sale if it was stolen or it never belonged to Ruth in the first place. So that messes up everything we just said. Because then, of course, Ruth is no gea b'davar, right? Because, and the assumption here is it was talked about a field, but any item that Ruth sells, right? You buy something in the black market. Now, normally you buy something in the black market, you know you're buying in the black market. If it turns out it was stolen, well, you're not going to get your money back. But Rav Papa says you will, because it was never theirs to sell in the first place. And therefore, of course, Ruth is no gea b'davar, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. And that's a whole question on this whole explanation of the Braita. Because As soon as Yehuda comes and claims, this didn't belong to Ruth, this belonged to me, Ruth has a total vested interest in proving that it was hers, because otherwise she will have to compensate, even if it wasn't b'achrayut. So, and remember, the whole Breita was ein achrayut alav, right? It's all because she has no responsibility. But according to Rav Papa, of course she has responsibility in this case. So how are we going to explain that? To which they say, interesting answer, hacha b'mayaskinan b'makirba shehi bat chamoro. So they say, what is the case? The case is where Naomi, okay, now what happens? Yehuda comes and says it's mine and brings witnesses. But his witnesses were false witnesses, and Naomi knows it. And Naomi says, I know it belonged to Ruth. I know she owned it. And then let's see what happens. So if Yehuda's witnesses come and say it's Yehuda's, and Ruth comes and says it's mine. Now, let's assume Yehuda succeeds, because the whole thing is Ruth can't testify here, right? She's noger b'davar, right? She's got a vested interest. And then we said, well, if it's movables, she doesn't have any vested interest. Well, what did we just say? According to Rav Papa, of course she has a vested interest, because if they take it away from Naomi, because Yehuda is the rightful owner, Naomi will go back to Ruth and say, I know you didn't give me a warranty on this, but this kind of thing, of course, is covered no matter what, and I'm going to get my money back. But not if Naomi admits that it belongs to Ruth. If Naomi says, I know those witnesses are liars, I know it's yours, Ruth. In that case, Ruth has nothing to lose, because Naomi can never go and claim it from Ruth, because even if Yehuda's people succeed and they're false witnesses and they succeed in taking it away from Naomi, Naomi can't go back to Ruth because she herself admitted that it belonged to Ruth. So you can't in one breath say, I know it's yours, Ruth, and another breath go take her to court and say, I want my money back. So that would have to be the case to answer Rav Papa's question. For Rav Zvid, it's much simpler, because Rav Zvid doesn't agree with Rav Papa. Rav Zvid amar afilu nimtzeit she'ena shelo eino chozer alav. When you sell something without final sale, no warranty, no guarantee, doesn't make a difference, right? Doesn't matter why it gets taken away from Naomi. Ruth never has to pay back. And that's why, right? That's why in the metaltalin case, Ruth has no vested interest and can testify. Damrale, because Ruth can say to her, that was exactly my point of saying final sale, no returns, no exchanges, nothing. That was my point, that I'm not accepting any responsibility whatsoever. That ends our daf for today. There's a little bit more left, but that's just a goofa. We're just going to go back to this statement. And right now they're just re-quoting the statement of Rabban Shmuel, Mishmei Shmuel, who said, sell a field without the warranty. You can't testify because you wanted to be there when the Baal Chov comes to collect. Okay. Anyway, we'll get back to that. All they did so far was quote it. They're going to ask a question. If Hidami, what exactly is the case? And we'll deal with that tomorrow. So the main thing we did today was we had two different explanations of how to understand the Breita, why we distinguish if you sell a house or a field versus if you sell movables. Why, when you sell the movables, will we let you testify about it, trying to keep the item in the person's hands? And why, if it's non-movables, we don't let you testify. We started with Rosh Hashanah, who complicated the case by saying there was a thief here, because that's why he thought there was a difference between taltalin and karka. Karka in an exelit. And right, land is never changes ownership, even if it does, it's still owned by the original person. They can always get it back, and that's why it's in their vested interest to keep it where it is, so they could get it back. Versus movables, where they can't get it back anyway. Once there's again yeyush and shinoi reshut, and then we tried to say, why is it not the case of an heir? And we said, well, not everybody agrees that that's called shinoi reshut. And then we had a whole two issues with Rav Sheshet, and we rejected it, and we went to the second interpretation, Rabban Shmuel, who basically gave the interpretation that we're talking about. The whole issue is it wasn't sold with achrayut, not in the land, not in the movables, although it could have been in the land also with achrayut. You wouldn't be able to testify, but even not with achrayut, you still can't testify because you want it to be there for collection purposes. Whereas movables are not there for collection purposes. And then we had all sorts of cases. Well, maybe it could be if it was done with land. We have to say in the end, well, the person had no land, and that's why you know it wasn't done together with land. And since no creditor could collect the movables, there's obviously no vested interest for Ruth in the whole situation. And then we just ended with these questions of maybe there is vested interest if Yehuda claims Ruth was never the owner, and then Ruth wants to say, I'm the owner, because if she doesn't, she's going to have to pay Naomi. So we had to say, according to Rav Papa, who holds that way, that it was a case where Naomi admits that it really belongs to Ruth, and therefore she can't go claiming money from her. And Rav Zvid, who doesn't even hold that way, so we didn't even have the question, according to him. That's what we're going to end for today. Quite complicated daf. I hope I managed in organizing it well enough for you. Wishing everybody a great day.